Ghostface just called and asked me if I like scary movies. Well, buckle up, Buttercup. Let me lay some knowledge on you. Well, I have just finished watching all the movies from the July 2024 HorrorPack. So, as is our way here on this channel, it's time to review them. As always, there will be links right down there in the What's It where you can find any of these movies for yourself, if any of them happen to catch your interest. While you're down there, be sure to click the thumbs up, subscribe, ring my bell, and check out all the wonderful notes I've put down in the aforementioned What's It where you can learn about all of my other projects. But we're not here for me to advertise, much as I need to keep doing so. We're here to talk about these movies. So let's get right to it, beginning with The Grudge, the Untold Chapter. Sometimes this is also just called The Grudge, a bit confusingly because it's not the original Grudge, but to put any confusion to the side, this is the one from 2019. And it's a sort of indirect sequel in the Grudge franchise. It combines the familiar features of The Grudge, the sort of curse in the Grudge films, with hints of a police procedural mystery, which I thought was a really interesting idea, even though neither element, the horror nor the mystery, ever fully comes into its own in the film. I think a lot of people might dislike this one because it makes heavy use of sometimes confusing, non-linear storytelling. And I think it tries to derive a lot of its scares as much from its format as from its content or plot or the things that happen to the characters. In that way, unlike the other American Grudge movies, it harkens back to the original Japanese films just a bit. But where it differs from its international source material is that it never quite manages to ratchet up the fear factor in quite the same way. Both the Japanese and this one have that non-linear element, but it's not quite as effective here as in the original films. And even though its plot is different, it manages to recycle some of the same scares from its predecessors, like the ghostly fingers in the hair bit that you see, in fact, on the cover art. I'm not quite sure how I should feel about that. On the one hand, that is a kind of iconic piece of the franchise. You know, taking the shower and you reach back and there's fingers in your hair. It's a frightening thing, and it was effective when it was first done, and it has become sort of indelibly associated with The Grudge, so it makes sense to include it. But on the other hand, I saw it coming from a mile away, and it just doesn't have the same oomph that it did the first time we saw it back in the day. The critics panned this movie, as indeed did most of the audience reviews I've happened across, but I found myself wondering whether I'd watched the same movie as some of those reviewers. By no means am I trying to call this a great movie. It's certainly not that. But neither is it terrible enough to have merited all the hate that it received. For me, it's a completely watchable, though largely forgettable, run-of-the-mill horror movie. And as such, I'll give it a grade of C+. Next up was Scars of Dracula, a Hammer movie starring Christopher Lee as the world's most feared vampire. Honestly, I could probably just stop my review right there because I think we all know that Hammer made some pretty good movies in decades past. And with Christopher Lee, well, that man could probably make just about anything worth watching. But that's not to say that Lee was compensating for a bad movie in this case. Indeed, it's pretty good on the whole. This is another one that critics didn't seem to like. Back in the day, a lot of people complained about excessive sex and violence in place of a more meaningful plot. It's hard to see that argument going very far in today's horror genre, though. I might even argue that the pendulum has swung too far toward the sensationalist, but if nothing else, I think we can say that Hammer was probably just a bit ahead of its time with Scars of Dracula. Though, of course, even at that, it's really pretty tame by today's standards. At the end of the day, there's not a lot here to surprise the audience, but fans of Dracula and or of Christopher Lee will find a lot to enjoy. It's pretty far from the best of the films in which the great actor portrays the Count, but it's also pretty far from the worst. I'll give this one a grade of B. That brings us to Hellboy. This is the 2019 one starring David Harbour. First of all, credit to the HorrorPack people because they didn't just send a regular Blu-ray, but they sent the 4K Ultra edition, so that was like a little extra bonus. But we're not really here to talk about the format, nice as it is to get the 4K Ultra version. We're here to talk about the movie itself. And on that note, well, this is one of those months, apparently, in which we get a bunch of movies that were panned by the critics because people hated this movie. Part of that, I think, was simply that different people were behind this one. It was directed by Neil Marshall instead of Guillermo del Toro, and starred David Harbour as Hellboy instead of Ron Perlman. Probably a lot of people were angry and honestly maybe even kind of hoping to hate the film simply because of those changes. But not me. I still wanted to enjoy it, and I wanted to give it a fair hearing on its own merits. However, one has to admit, it's simply not a great movie. A lot of the acting, even from generally high-quality performers, fell a little bit flat. Maybe they were just phoning it in to get a paycheck, maybe the director wasn't directing them well enough, or maybe it was just a lackluster script filled with awkward dialogue. My money's on the latter because the script itself, while coherent, felt more like a draft than a finished product. Add to that action sequences that rely pretty much entirely on CGI, not only where it makes sense to use CGI, but even where practical effects would have served better and probably would have been cheaper to do. And there is, honestly, a lot to complain about with this film. That said, do I think it's as bad as most of the critics did? Not at all. It's not a good movie by any stretch, but neither is it unwatchably bad. And if you want to pour yourself a drink and watch something mindless and fun, it might not be the best choice in the world, but it'll certainly do the job for you. All of that boils down to a grade of C-. Finally, we have the HorrorPack exclusive. That's exclusive number 97. It's a brand new film called Huntress. This is one I'd never even heard of before opening the HorrorPack, and subsequently having done a little bit of digging around the internet, it seems like neither had pretty much anybody else. But don't let that turn you off. Despite some flaws, this one actually turned out to be something of a hidden gem. It's set toward the end of the Second World War and follows an Allied medical team on a mission to get a wounded officer to a medical facility. But, of course, they get lost and stranded behind enemy lines, and some Nazis manage to shoot their gas tank, so they need to find a new source of fuel. Along the way, they encounter a mysterious young girl who offers aid, but seems to be something other than the purely good Samaritan she presents herself to be. I don't want to spoil too much beyond that, but I think that sort of gives you a good taste for what this film is about. What I liked about this one is that despite a clearly low budget, it managed to make the most of its small cast and a good setting to create a war movie for a lot less expense than one might expect. Usually when you think of a war movie, you're thinking of airplanes and tanks and huge explosions and multi-hundreds of million-dollar budgets. This is not that. This is a war movie condensed down to the very small-scale human aspect. What really stood out to me were some interesting character dynamics explored in the film's first half, before the horror really gets started. No, it's not perfect, and yeah, it's probably more predictable than it should be, but it does strike a very strong balance between character on the one hand and action on the other, and though it's relatively short on real scares, it does a pretty good job of presenting itself as a metaphor for the horrors of war. I'll give this one a B-. So all in all, a pretty good month for HorrorPack. I wouldn't say these blew me away, but I didn't dislike any of them, and that always makes me happy. But, making me less happy, this brings us to the end of our time together for today. Never to fear, though, I'm always cooking up something creepy, and you won't be long to wait for my next video. Until then, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and as always, take care and stay scared.